everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new Mystery with Mollie. If you are new around here, if you have never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Mollie and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe and don't forget to switch on the little notification bell so that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. This week we are going to be talking about a solved case from Washington, the case of Mandy Stavik. Mandy Stavik was a popular young woman with an incredible future ahead of her, but in November of 1989, that future was cruelly snatched away when Mandy left her house to go on a jog and never returned. She'd been the victim of a brutal homicide, and despite the attention that her case received, tragically it went cold, and her murder remained unsolved for years and years. But then, literally decades after the crime, the police received the breakthrough that they'd been waiting for, when two local mums came forward with a name, the name of the individual that they believed was responsible for this abhorrent crime. Join me as we delve into the sadistic story of Mandy Stavik. But quickly, before we get into the case, I would like to say a big thank you to HelloFresh for very kindly sponsoring this section of the video. I'm sure you guys have heard me talk about HelloFresh on my channel before. I've been using them for literally years now. They are a meal kit delivery service and they offer a huge variety of delicious recipes every single week, which can be delivered straight to your door. Now we are entering a new season. Spring is officially upon us, and this spring I really want to try and make an effort to eat more fresh food. I want fresh and wholesome ingredients that are going to really nourish my body and make me feel good. But I'll hold my hands up, I am not the best cook and I'm not very good at coming up with new recipes, so that is why HelloFresh is such a godsend for me. They make cooking at home so much easier. You literally just pick the meals that you would like to try on their website and they will do the rest. They will send you the instructions and a box full of all of the ingredients that you will need, saving you the hassle of having to go out to the supermarket, and it also saves you a huge amount of food waste because HelloFresh will send you the right amount of ingredients that you'll need for the amount of people that you're cooking for. So if you're cooking for 2, they'll send you the right amount for 2. If you're cooking for 4, they'll send you the right amount for 4. But with HelloFresh, you can change the amount of portions that you'll need week to week. You can pause your deliveries. You can even cancel your subscription whenever you want. So you can be completely flexible. So if you would like to give HelloFresh a try for yourself, then you can find a link to their website at the top line of the description box. And for those of you who also live in the UK, listen up because I have an amazing offer to share with you. If you use the code Westbrook, you will receive 60% off of your first box and 20% off of the next 2 months, plus free desserts for life. Yep, you heard me, for life. So take advantage. Go get your free desserts because you deserve them. And you can also scan the QR code that is on the screen right now to receive that offer too. Thank you so much once again to HelloFresh for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel. Thank you to all of you guys watching for always showing your support to the sponsors on this channel. And now let's just get into the case. But just before we continue, please listen carefully to the following. This video contains heavy themes such as rape and sexual assault, domestic abuse, and also threats of suicide. Viewer discretion is advised. So for this week's case, we are going back more than 3.5 decades now to late 1989 in Acme, which is a little village located in Whatcom County in Washington in the US. And this is Amanda Teresa Stavik. She was an 18-year-old girl who lived in Acme with her family. Amanda, who mostly went by Mandy, was born on the 16th of April 1971. Her father was named Glenn and her mother was named Mary. And I believe Mandy was one of 4 children. She had a sister named Mollie and 2 brothers named Lee and Brent. And I also read on one source that she had a stepbrother named Spencer too. So one of 5 children actually. Although, according to articles, Mandy tragically lost 2 of her brothers. 2 of them passed away. Brent Stavik died in 1975, so when Mandy would have been only around 4 years old, and he was killed during a hunting trip and was found shot to death. And tragically, his death remains unsolved to this day. The circumstances which led to him being found shot have never been uncovered, tragically. And apparently her stepbrother Spencer died too. He died during some kind of boating accident when he was around 20 years old, just the year before this case occurred, in fact. So yeah, the Stavik family had to deal with a lot of heartbreak, a lot of tragedy, which is just awful. I can't imagine how painful all of that must have been. Now, the Stavik family were originally from the city of Anchorage in Alaska. However, when Mandy's parents, Glenn and Mary, decided to separate, that was when they relocated to Acme in Washington. Mary moved there with Mandy, Lee and Mollie, and I believe her father stayed in Alaska. They moved to Acme when Mandy was in the 7th grade and began their new life there, and they seemed to really like it in Acme. It was a really nice, quiet and friendly little village. Mandy became a student at the Mount Baker High School. She was an honor student and she was an incredibly popular young girl in school, both with her peers and her teachers, and she seemed to get involved in as many school activities as she could, really, particularly sporty activities. She was a very athletic young girl. She enjoyed horse riding and softball, basketball, running track, cheerleading. In addition to that, she was in the school band and she would play the flute and the clarinet and the saxophone. She was fluent in sign language and could even speak some Japanese. So I mean, she was clearly an incredibly intelligent young girl and very talented. In her mother Mary's words, Mandy wanted to do everything. Mary also said of her daughter, quote, "She was very everything. I don't know that there are words to describe her. I'm just an ordinary person. I don't know how I managed to have that child." Mandy was just thought of so highly by everyone that knew her, and everyone knew that she would go on to do great things with her life. She had that kind of drive and determination to really be able to do anything that she set her mind to, and apparently her dream was to become an airline pilot one day. Mandy was described by her loved ones as being larger than life, and after she graduated from high school in 1989, she then became a freshman at the Central Washington University, which meant that she was living away from home. However, in November of 1989, 18-year-old Mandy Stavik returned home to the town of Acme to spend Thanksgiving weekend with her family, and that is when this case took place. The day following Thanksgiving, on the 24th of November 1989, Mandy Stavik left her family home intent on going for a run, which was something that she did often. As I said, she was a very sporty and active young girl. Now, sources state that often when she was home, she would go out for a run with her mum Mary. Well, her mum Mary would go on her bicycle and she would kind of ride alongside Mandy as she ran. But on this particular day, Mandy didn't go with her mum. Instead, she took the family dog Kyra with her. Kyra was a German Shepherd. So she and Kyra left the house at around 2:30 that afternoon and they went for a run. Mandy started running along her regular route, which was along Strand Road in Acme. Strand Road was the road that she lived on, and she would usually run all the way to the Nooksack River and then back again, a route that she was very familiar with and had taken many times before. And yet, for some reason, on this particular day, Mandy never returned home. Her dog did. Kyra returned to the house about 2 hours after she and Mandy left, but Mandy wasn't with her. So then where was she? Why was Kyra just on her own? So of course, when Kyra returned without Mandy, her mother Mary became very anxious, and the first thing that she decided to do was contact Mandy's boyfriend. She did have a boyfriend at the time that this case occurred, and his name was Rick. So Mary got in touch with Rick and asked him if he knew where Mandy was. Was she with him? She wasn't. She called Mandy's friends just in case any of them knew Mandy's whereabouts. Had she gone to see a friend after her run without telling Mary? But of course, she had no luck there either. And so shortly after this, Mary picked up the phone again, this time to call the police and report her 18-year-old daughter as missing. And thus the investigation into the disappearance of Mandy Stavik began. And one of the very first things the police did actually was look closely at her boyfriend Rick. Obviously, we know that the partners are usually the very first people that the police look at when someone goes missing or is murdered. However, in this case, it soon became pretty clear that Rick was not involved in whatever had happened to Mandy. He was very cooperative with the detectives, and they seemed to be very happy together. They'd been a couple kind of on and off for a good few years by this point. And yeah, Rick was more or less ruled out as a potential suspect. Searches for Mandy were quickly underway, and apparently volunteers quickly joined the search too. A lot of local people came forward and offered to help the police look for her, so clearly news of her disappearance spread very rapidly. And with this, the police received some information from a member of the public who claimed that he had seen Mandy on her run that afternoon. He seemed to provide one of the last sightings of her. This member of the public said that he was parked up in his pickup truck on the side of Strand Road, less than a mile away from Mandy's house, when he saw her jogging past him, and she was headed in the direction of her house, so clearly she was heading back there. In addition to that, also one of the last sightings of her actually came from her brother Lee. On the afternoon that Mandy vanished, Lee was at his friend's house. His friend lived just further down Strand Road, and Lee recalled looking out of the window that afternoon and seeing his sister during her run, and again she was heading in the direction of their house. So it seemed as though whatever had happened to Mandy that afternoon happened very close to her home. Something occurred during her route home which meant that she never made it back. Had she had an accident or something? Had she tripped or fallen and injured her leg or ankle and just couldn't get up? I have a quote here from Mandy's sister Mollie. She said, "We just prayed that they would find her alive. You think to yourself, God, maybe she's just hurt, she can't get home." However, as it would turn out, that wouldn't be the case, as just 3 days after Mandy was last seen, her body was discovered about 6 miles away from her family home. On the 27th of November 1989, as the police were conducting searches along the Nooksack River in Acme, Detective Ron Peterson, who was leading the search for Mandy, suddenly spotted something pink in the water in the distance as they were moving upriver in this inflatable boat. There was something pink floating in the water near the shore, so they started moving closer towards this object, and that was when Detective Peterson realised that it was Mandy. She was lying in the shallow water, completely lifeless, and she was naked. She wasn't wearing any clothing apart from her socks, and her running shoes were still on her feet, and the rest of her clothing that she had been wearing during her run were not found in the water or anywhere at the scene. Now, I did read on one source that just the day before her body was found, the search and rescue team discovered a pair of green sweatpants just discarded on the roadside, and they thought that they could have been Mandy's because she was wearing green sweatpants when she left the house for her run. But when these sweatpants were shown to her mother Mary, Mary couldn't be certain whether or not they were definitely her daughter's. I can imagine that, you know, being an avid runner, Mandy probably had quite a lot of running gear that Mary had seen, so yeah, Mary couldn't be sure whether or not they were Mandy's. She was actually more so thinking that they weren't, because the sweatpants were apparently very dirty and they had these holes in, and Mary said that Mandy wouldn't have worn sweatpants that were in that kind of condition, although perhaps they weren't when she left the house. Maybe they ended up being dirty and with holes in as a result of some kind of violent struggle, who knows. But apparently, again, these could never be confirmed to have been Mandy's sweatpants, even when they were sent off to the lab for analysis, and the rest of her clothing was never recovered. I don't believe they were missing. When Detective Ron Peterson approached Mandy's body in the water, he carefully pulled her out, and as he did so, he said to her, "I got ya." And when her body was sent for an autopsy, it was of course established that she had been horrifically murdered, although her cause of death was determined to have been asphyxia by drowning. The medical examiner did observe that Mandy had an injury to the top of her head consistent with, you know, being hit over the head, and that, combined with the fact that there were no signs of a struggle by the water's edge where Mandy was found, indicated to the police that this injury to her head more than likely knocked her unconscious. It didn't kill her, it just knocked her out. And then it's believed that following this injury, she was taken by the attacker to the river, where they either just allowed her to drown under the water or they held her under the water until she died. Of course, the fact that she was found naked also indicated a sexual assault, which was confirmed during her autopsy, as traces of semen were discovered inside of her body. Mandy had been raped by her killer. although no matches to this male DNA was found on the police system at the time. The police's theory as to what happened to Mandy that afternoon is that she must have been attacked by someone who was in a car, because again, Mandy was a runner and a fast one at that. So chances are if someone was chasing her, she more than likely would have been able to outrun them. So they believe that as she was running, she was confronted by the attacker. He pulled his vehicle over and possibly threatened her with some kind of weapon, maybe a knife or a gun. It's believed that the attacker probably pushed or kicked the dog Kyra into a ditch, forced Mandy into their car, and then drove away to the Nooksack River. After being sexually assaulted by the perpetrator, the police then believe that Mandy tried to escape and make a run for it due to the fact that she had what looked like a load of scratches on both her arms and her legs, and these scratches appeared as though they had been caused by thorns. You see, there were a load of blackberry bushes around this area, so the police think that she was able to escape at some point, and she started literally running through these bushes away from the attacker, causing the scratches from the thorns. But tragically, they caught up to her, and that was when she was hit in the head, knocked out, and then taken to the shallow water by the shore of the Nooksack River and left to drown. Naturally, following the discovery of Mandy's body, news of her murder spread like wildfire, and as you can imagine, it left the community in Acme in just this state of utter shock. The fact that this bright and beautiful young woman had just been brutally murdered while she was out on a run, it devastated everyone in the community. Everyone knew about the murder of Mandy Stavik, and it was almost like the whole town was in mourning because Mandy was loved by so many people. Many tips and leads came in from members of the public after Mandy's body was found, with many people saying, oh, the killer could have been this person or it could have been this guy, and several men were looked into and their DNA was taken to be compared against the semen recovered from Mandy's body. Saliva samples from about 30 local men were taken in total, but again, the police never found a match. The police even looked into the possibility that perhaps Mandy could have been another victim of the back then unidentified Green River serial killer who operated in Washington. We now know that the Green River killer was Gary Ridgway, so this was looked into as a theory, but ultimately it was more or less ruled out as it was determined that Mandy didn't quite fit the profile of the Green River killer. The police, unfortunately, just didn't really have much to go on in this case. Yes, they had the DNA of Mandy's killer, but obviously this was the late 80s, and whilst they could test this DNA against potential suspects, it wasn't like they had the techniques back then to be able to do much more than that, like for example find potential relatives of the killer through DNA or predict what the killer may have looked like through DNA phenotyping. That just wasn't a thing yet, and sadly all of the tips and the leads that they were receiving from the public were just resulting in dead ends, and the case of Mandy Stavik remained unsolved and ended up going cold. And with each year that passed with no closure, Mandy's mother Mary said that she just eventually lost hope. She really believed that that was it. The police would never catch the evil man who took her daughter away from her. Mandy would never get justice for her murder. But despite her case going cold, no one ever forgot it. Everyone in Acme always remembered Mandy, always remembered her murder. It really did just stay with everyone. In 2009, it was the 20-year anniversary of Mandy's death. 2 decades had passed, and that was the year when the case was reopened, and it was taken over by Detective Kevin Bowie from the Sheriff's Office. And Detective Bowie's plan to finally get an answer as to who killed Mandy was to basically compile a list of all of the men that were living in Acme at the time of Mandy's murder and tracking them down and asking them to give a voluntary DNA sample which could be tested against the DNA profile of Mandy Stavik's killer. And so that is what he set out to do, but of course a task as big as this one would take time. Having to work out who lived in Acme 20 years ago and then trying to locate them, this wasn't going to be a quick process. In fact, it would probably take years. Well, it did. Years were going by, and one by one the police were testing DNA samples of men that had lived in Acme, and one by one they were being eliminated. eliminated. No match was found, and I can imagine that this must have been a very tedious process, with the new team thinking, oh my god, are we ever going to get a match? Was Mandy's killer someone who lived outside of Acme at the time of her death and just happened to be passing through the area on the day that she disappeared? It just seemed as though in this case it was dead end after dead end constantly. Every lead, every DNA sample, every suspect, everything was resulting in a dead end. But then came 2013, 4 years after the case was reopened and 24 years after the case took place, when finally there was a huge development, which came in the form of a tip submitted by an unexpected source, shall we say, or two unexpected sources even. On a sunny day in June of 2013, two local mothers named Heather Backstorm and Marilee Anderson were at a water park with their kids when they just happened to start a conversation with each other, as mums do. They got chatting whilst their kids were playing on the water slide, and the two women didn't really know each other prior to this. It turned out that they'd both grown up in Acme and that they actually used to go to the same high school as Mandy, Mount Baker High School. But they, Heather and Marilee, weren't really familiar with each other, so I guess it was basically like they were meeting for the first time at the water park. So yeah, anyway, they struck up a conversation, they started talking about pretty normal things, and then eventually the conversation progressed into talking about the unsolved murder of Mandy Stavik, which of course still haunted the community in Acme. Like I said, everyone in Acme knew about her murder and no one ever forgot what happened to her. And during this conversation about Mandy, randomly Heather said to Marilee something along the lines of, you know, I'm pretty sure that I know who murdered Mandy. And bizarrely, Marilee responded to this saying, I do too. Despite not knowing each other, would you believe it, both women had always had the suspicion that the same individual was responsible for Mandy Stavik's brutal murder. They both believed that Mandy's killer was a man named Timothy Bass. Timothy Bass was also a former student at the Mount Baker High School. He was around 46 years old at this point in 2013, meaning that he would have been about 22 at the time that this case occurred in 1989, so he was only about 4 years older than Mandy. And the reason for this, the reason that Heather and Marilee always held this belief, was because both women had had very disturbing encounters with Tim Bass before, both around the time that Mandy Stavik was killed. Well, one of them took place shortly before, the other shortly after. So Heather's disturbing encounter with Tim Bass occurred just a few months before Mandy's death in mid-1989. One day, she and Tim Bass had both attended the same softball game, and she said that after the game, she and Tim and some other friends of theirs all got into the same truck and they decided to head to a Dairy Queen restaurant. Now, Heather and Tim knew each other because Tim was good friends with this guy named Dan, who would go on to become Heather's future husband. Her and Dan later got married, but Heather was only about 15 at the time that this happened and Tim Bass was 21. Anyway, they all got into this truck and they headed to Dairy Queen, and Heather and Tim just happened to be sitting next to each other in the truck, and Tim began complimenting Heather in the car, telling her that she was beautiful, that she had beautiful eyes. And then following this, he grabbed a pen out of this cup holder in the car and he began just like rubbing it along her legs and her knees, which just made Heather feel really uncomfortable and uneasy. She didn't really know what to do. I mean, she was just 15 years old and Tim was a fully grown adult man. And that experience with Tim Bass just always stuck with Heather. Ever since that day, she just had this bad feeling about him, it seemed. As for Marilee, her encounter with Tim Bass was nothing short of terrifying. Her experience with him took place just under 2 years after Mandy Stavik was murdered in the summer of 1991. And she said that one night night she was home alone, or well, she was with her son who was very young at the time. It was just them two in the house, when suddenly someone knocked at her front door. It was Tim Bass. Tim asked Merrily if he could please come inside to use her telephone because he said that he'd been out all day and that he needed to call his partner. By this point, he was actually married to a woman named Gina. So Merrily said, okay, she let Tim do just that. She let him in and allowed him to use the phone. However, he didn't actually use the phone. He picked it up and kind of pretended like he was using it, but I mean, it was obvious to Merrily that he wasn't. So I can imagine that she probably started panicking at this point, thinking, well, if he hasn't come in to use the phone, then what is his intention? What does he want? After pretending to use the phone, Merrily said that Tim Bass just started walking around her house. He walked through the kitchen and into Merrily's bedroom, and then he started saying to Merrily things like, oh, I'm in love with you. I've driven past your house several times before just to see you. He told her that he wanted to make love to her, just really, really creepy things like that. And so Merrily ordered him to leave immediately, but he wouldn't get out of her house. And so Merrily started saying to Tim, I'm going to call the police if you don't go. And clearly that spooked him, because it wasn't until she said that when finally he left. So as I said, both women, both Heather Backstrom and Merrily Anderson, had very scary encounters with Tim Bass, and that's why for all these years they just had an inkling that he may have been responsible for the murder of Mandy Stavik, but they never told anyone about these gut feelings that they had. They never told the police back when these encounters took place, and they said that the reason for that was simply because they were scared. You know, it's a huge thing to accuse someone of murder and to accuse someone just based off of a gut feeling rather than actual evidence, I suppose, which linked them to the crime. I don't know, maybe they just thought that that was a bit silly to do. But then nearly 2.5 decades later, in June of 2013, when Heather Backstrom and Merrily Anderson met at the water park and they shared their experiences that they'd each had with Tim Bass, I think it made Merrily in particular realise that, you know, it was worth finally going to the police and passing on Tim Bass's name as a potential suspect. Maybe he was innocent of Mandy's murder, but it was time to at least notify the detectives of these suspicions that she and Heather had held in for so long. Merrily Anderson contacted a detective from the local sheriff's office who she actually knew from school, and she told him that Tim Bass was someone that they might want to look into in regards to the killing of Mandy Stavik. But before we continue with the case, let me just tell you a little bit more about Tim Bass, about who he was and about his life leading up to this point, leading up to 2013. So Tim Bass obviously lived in Acme at the time that this case occurred in 1989. I believe he grew up there with his parents and also his younger brother. He had a younger brother named Tom who was actually friends with Mandy Stavik. They were a similar age and Mandy and Tom got along well. And the Bass family seemed to be a very normal family. They were actually a very respected family. They were well liked in Acme, and in fact it was for that reason that Tim and his brother and father were never looked at as people of interest in Mandy's case. They weren't amongst any of the men who were asked to provide DNA samples in the original investigation because, well, I guess the police had no reason to think that any of them would have been involved. They'd never been in trouble with the law before or displayed any kind of unusual or suspicious behaviour as far as the police knew anyway. As a kid, Tim Bass seemed to be kind of a loner, someone who very much kept himself to himself. His younger brother Tom suggested that Tim was always a very kind of socially awkward person. And apparently when he was in high school, Tim actually threatened suicide. And the reason for this was because this girl that he was seeing decided to break up with him. He was on the phone to her in his bedroom when she ended things, and he said that he was going to shoot himself because of this, and he actually had a gun in his hand whilst he was saying this, and he did fire it, but not at himself. He just fired it in the air, I think whilst he was still on the phone to this girlfriend. So I suppose he wanted her to think that he really had killed himself, which is so sick and twisted. But his younger brother Tom and others who knew Tim said that it was almost like from this day on, from the day that his high school girlfriend broke up with him, Tim Bass just suddenly developed this hatred towards women. He no longer had any respect for them. He was still attracted to women, but at the same time, they almost disgusted him. It was like for him, his ex-girlfriend represented all women, and because she dared to split up with him, he resented her and every single woman. Women were 100% the inferior sex in his eyes, but that didn't stop him from marrying a woman. As I mentioned before, he married a woman named Gina, and that was when Tim was about 22 years old. In fact, he actually married Gina in January of 1990, about a month and a half after Mandy Stavik disappeared and was killed. He and Gina eventually went on to have 3 children together, and they were married for nearly 3 decades. However, Gina claimed that this relationship was far from a happy one because Tim was an incredibly abusive husband. Gina said that Tim honestly treated her like she was his servant, not his wife. He would tell her what to do and order her around, constantly ordering her to get him a drink or make him food. He would just speak to her like crap in general, always telling her to shut up. He was controlling, telling her what she could wear and who she could talk to. And Gina described how for her, their marriage felt like a prison. She felt trapped with Tim Bass, trapped in this life of abuse at the hands of the man who claimed to love her. At one point, Gina did find the strength to leave the marriage and begin to file for divorce, and she actually attempted to take out a restraining order against her husband. However, Tim got inside of her head, and he essentially said that if she proceeded with this, he was going to do everything that he could to make sure that she lost all custody of their 3 kids, and he was going to take their kids away from her. And of course, this terrified Gina, terrified her into staying with him because she couldn't risk losing her children. By the time Tim Bass's name was passed on to the police in 2013, he worked as a delivery driver for this bakery, and he and his family lived in the city of Everson in Washington, which is just under 20 miles away from Acme. Although, just as a side note, when the police began looking further into Tim Bass, they actually discovered that when he did live in Acme at the time of Mandy's murder, his house was on the same street less than 2 miles away from where the Stavik family home was. So he lived very, very close to the route that Mandy would usually run along, and of course she was abducted from. But again, despite this, none of the men in the Bass family, including Tim, were looked at as people of interest in the original investigation. But now, in 2013, that was all about to change as a result of that tip that detectives received from the 2 mums, Heather and Merrilee. So following this tip, the detectives went to Everson to speak with Tim Bass about the Mandy Stavik case, and Tim's reaction to this really made alarm bells ring instantly for the police, because he acted as though he didn't even know who Mandy was. He didn't remember her. He didn't remember her murder, which, to be honest, the detectives just did not believe at all because, I mean, firstly, I've said it a few times in this video, but everyone who lived in Acme and surrounding areas at this time knew this case without a doubt. It shook the entire community and everyone was talking about it, let alone the fact that Tim Bass literally lived less than 2 miles away from Mandy's house, and his younger brother Tom was friends with Mandy. So, I mean, to say to the police that he just didn't remember her seemed impossible. Perhaps he was saying that, he was acting like he didn't remember Mandy because he was trying to almost distance himself from her case as much as possible because who knows, maybe he had a guilty conscience. Eventually, when the police kept asking him about her, he finally seemed to suddenly remember Mandy and her case. So then the police asked him if he would be willing to give over a sample of his DNA so that his DNA could be compared against the DNA of her murderer and he could be definitively ruled out as a suspect. However, Tim Bass refused. He told the police that he wasn't willing to give his DNA. And he basically said that the reason being was because he watched a load of crime shows and he said, oh, I've seen how loads of people go to prison when they give their DNA. Well, yeah, if their DNA is a match and they're guilty, of course they're going to go to prison. He essentially said that he didn't trust the police and so he didn't want to give a sample, and obviously the police couldn't force him to at this point because they had no solid evidence actually linking him to the crime. But this meeting with Tim Bass really just skyrocketed him right to the top of the suspect list. He just seemed very suspicious to the police and they really started to think that he may have been the guy. He may have been Mandy Stavik's killer. But how on earth were they going to prove it? If he wasn't going to give his DNA, how on earth were they possibly going to obtain the evidence to connect him to this homicide? Well, they were going to have to try and do it in secret, somehow secretly obtain his DNA sample. And so, in an effort to do this, they put Tim Bass under surveillance and began just following him whilst he was working, because obviously he was a bakery delivery driver, and they were hoping that at some point during one of his delivery routes they would catch him discarding of something that might have his DNA on, like a napkin or some cutlery or something. However, he never did, and I wonder if this was again because of the crime shows that he watched. He knew that the police wanted his DNA and maybe he had a feeling that the police could have been watching him, and so he was really careful not to discard of anything that could have had his DNA on. Speaking of those crime shows that he would watch, by the way, his wife Gina would later go on to say that during their marriage, whilst he would watch these crime shows, Tim would always make comments to her about how the murderers in these shows were stupid and how he would never be stupid enough to get caught. He was too smart to be caught for murder, which I think that in itself is almost very telling. Anyway, putting him under surveillance proved to be a dead end, as I said, but as part of their investigation into Tim, as well as trying to get his DNA, the police were also, I guess, just trying to learn as much about him as possible, and they went and spoke with his boss at the bakery where he worked. Her name was Kim Wagner, and they asked Kim for her thoughts on Tim Bass, what kind of guy he was, and she basically said that she always thought of him as being a very weird individual, to be honest. He could be very condescending towards Kim, and he would always refer to her as woman. He wouldn't call her her name, he would just call her woman. And Kim also said that you never knew which side of Tim Bass you would get at work. Sometimes he would turn up for a shift and be nice, other times not so nice, and he was very quick to anger. You never knew where you stood with him, I suppose. Now, as I understand it, initially Kim didn't realise why the police were asking these questions about her employee Tim Bass. They obviously didn't tell her that they were looking at him as a potential suspect in the unsolved murder of Mandy Stavik. And so when the police began asking Kim questions about like Tim's delivery routes that he would take and some of his details, she and his other employers basically turned the police away. And they said, sorry, but we're not giving you access to that kind of information unless you have a subpoena, which the police didn't have. And so once again, it seemed as though they'd hit a brick wall with their investigation into Tim Bass, or at least that was until a couple of years later, around 2017, when one day Kim Wagner was out with her husband and some friends of theirs, and the topic of conversation somehow got onto her co-workers. They were chatting about her employees at the bakery, and they got talking about Tim Bass, and apparently one of her friends mentioned how Tim Bass and his family used to live on the same street as Mandy Stavik when she was killed in 1989. And Kim said that as soon as she heard this comment, it was like a light went off in her head, and she realised that that must have been why police had come to her work and were asking questions about Tim Bass a few years ago. It's because he was a suspect in Mandy's case. So upon coming to this realisation, Kim decided that she was going to do whatever she could to help the detectives. If Tim really was the killer, she wanted to help prove it for Mandy and her family, who'd gone all of these years without closure. And so Kim essentially offered to be a spy for the detective. She told them that she would watch Tim Bass at work like a hawk, and if he ever discarded of something that could have had his DNA on, she would collect it and give it to the police, and that's exactly what she did. One day, whilst at work, she noticed Tim Bass throw away an empty can of Coke and a plastic cup, both of which he had obviously drunk out of and therefore would have had his saliva on. And so when he left the room, she quickly grabbed the can and the cup and she gave it straight to the detectives, who sent them off for testing. And eventually the results were in. It was a match. The DNA from this cup and Coke can were an exact match to the DNA profile of Mandy Stavik's killer. It was a match to the semen that was found inside of her body, confirming the police's suspicions. Timothy Bass really was the killer. And so shortly after the match was made, in December of 2017, the detectives went to Tim Bass's place of work, the bakery, and they arrested him then and there on suspicion of the kidnap, rape and murder of Mandy Stavik. And not long after this, he was charged, and the police could finally give the Stavik family the news that they'd been waiting for more than 28 years. Mandy's killer had finally been apprehended. Tim Bass was obviously questioned by the detectives about Mandy's murder, which he completely denied. He protested his innocence and said that he was not responsible for this crime. And so when it came to his court proceedings, he pleaded not guilty and a trial date had to be set. The trial took place in the spring of 2019, and during the trial, Tim and his defense team had an explanation prepared for why Tim's DNA was on Mandy Stavik. Despite the fact that initially Tim Bass claimed to the police that he couldn't even remember who Mandy Stavik was, he was now claiming that actually he and Mandy had been having a sexual relationship for months before her death. He said that they became good friends in the spring of 1989, I think, and eventually this friendship led to something more. They weren't a couple, but they did begin sleeping with each other, so a kind of friends with benefits situation, even though Mandy already had a boyfriend, Rick. And Bass claimed that on the day that Mandy was killed, she'd shown up to his house earlier that day and they'd slept together, and so that's why his DNA would have been inside of her. Now, the defense did bring forward a forensic expert, Dr. Elizabeth Johnson, to give evidence during the trial because in her opinion, the semen found inside of Mandy could have been deposited several hours, if not days, before her death, which would, I guess, back up Tim's story that they'd had consensual sex earlier on the day that she disappeared. However, the prosecution had an expert of their own to discredit this. They brought forward Dr. Gary Goldfogel, the medical examiner who actually conducted Mandy's autopsy back in 1989, and he strongly disagreed with Dr. Johnson's findings. He claimed that the semen was deposited inside of Mandy much sooner. In his expert opinion, she'd been raped and then murdered very soon afterwards, and so this didn't align with Tim Bass's account. The prosecution, of course, strongly refuted Tim Bass's entire story. It was obvious to them that this was just a cover-up attempt by Bass, because if this really did happen, if he and Mandy really did have a sexual relationship, why the hell did he act like he couldn't even remember her when he was first approached by the police? It doesn't make any sense. The prosecution also didn't believe this story because there was no evidence whatsoever that he and Mandy had ever had any kind of contact with each other. There was no one who ever saw them together. There were no telephone records to show that they ever spoke on the phone. There was nothing to suggest that they were having this kind of secret affair like Tim claimed. The prosecution's theory as to what really happened was that Tim Bass became fixated with Mandy Stavik as he would often see her jogging past his house along her running route. He was sexually attracted to her. He developed this obsession with her, and so on that fateful day back in November of 1989, as she was running, he decided to abduct her and sexually assault her. And perhaps he decided to kill Mandy too, because she obviously knew who he was. He was Tom Bass's older brother, and she could go straight to the police and report what he had done. And he had to stop that from happening. He decided that he had to silence her. The prosecution brought forward several people to testify against Tim Bass during the trial. In fact, a couple were even his own family members. His ex-wife Gina took to the stand, and I believe she told the court about all of the abuse that she had suffered at the hands of Tim Bass throughout their marriage. And Gina also said during her testimony that when Tim began to realise that he was being looked at as a potential suspect in Mandy's case, she actually witnessed him asking his own mother to lie for him and essentially accuse her husband, Tim's father, of having killed Mandy, because his father had passed away by this point, and clearly Tim knew that his father's DNA profile would be very, very similar to his, so he thought that he could just point the finger at his dad. But Gina said that his mother refused to accuse her deceased husband. And someone else who also gave evidence against Tim during the trial was his own brother Tom. Tom took the stand and he gave a similar story. He said that Tim had also asked Tom to lie for him too. Tom said that in 2015, whilst his brother was under investigation, Tim told him about how he'd had a secret sexual relationship with Mandy, and he asked Tom if he could lie to the police and say that he too had slept with Mandy before her death, to which Tom said, no, absolutely not. It was obvious that Tim was asking Tom to do this because he wanted to make it look like Mandy was someone who slept with several different people, to hopefully make the police believe his story, believe that he had in fact had a sexual relationship with Mandy, if that makes sense. Tom also claimed during the trial that he too was present during an occasion when Tim had asked their mother to lie for him. Apparently Tim asked his mum to provide him with a false alibi on the afternoon that Mandy was killed, and he told her to tell the police that she and her son were out Christmas shopping together at the time that Mandy's murder took place, and so he couldn't have been the killer. Now, his mother denied all of this. She stuck by her eldest son and claimed that Tim never asked her to lie for him. But I mean, you've got two people here, Gina and Tom, who refuted that and claimed that he did. So when the trial came to a close, the jury was sent off to deliberate, and on the 24th of May 2019 they returned with a verdict of guilty. Timothy Bass had been found guilty of the kidnap, rape and murder of 18-year-old Mandy Stavik about 29 and a half years after the crime. At his sentencing, Tim Bass addressed the court himself, still protesting his innocence and claiming that he didn't believe he had received a fair trial. But regardless, he was of course sentenced, and he was given a term of 27 years in prison, and so that is obviously where he remains to this day. During the time that this case was unsolved, there was a $25,000 reward for information which would lead to the identity of Mandy Stavik's killer. And so in the aftermath of this case, after her murder was solved, this money was donated to Mandy's old high school, the Mount Baker High School, and they put this money towards a scholarship fund that they'd set up in Mandy's name as a legacy for her, which I think is just lovely and very, very fitting. And that is it for this case. That concludes the case of Mandy Stavik. It took nearly 3 decades for Mandy to receive justice. For 3 decades, her loved ones had to just live with the agony of not knowing who did this to her, which is awful to comprehend. But thankfully they got that closure in the end, and hopefully Mandy can finally rest in peace. But yeah, that is it for this video. As always, do let me know your thoughts and opinions on the case down below in the comments. I would love to hear what you guys think, and also feel free to let me know of any other cases that you would like to see me cover on this channel. They can be solved cases, unsolved cases, serial killer cases, cases. Again, you can pop them down below in the comments, or alternatively, I do have a case request form linked in the description box if you would prefer to go through that. Thank you all so much for watching. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Mollie. Bye.